In this video lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the concept of democracy, and specifically understanding it is a continuum. And when you start thinking about democracy as a continuum, that's really going to be something we call democratization. So to understand this continuum, let's think about the two major buckets of categories that states can be. And those two major buckets are democratic states and authoritarian states. Democratic states are states that are defined by individual freedom, by participation in elections, by a civil society and openness. And they are weaker states. And what we mean in this context, as we've talked about earlier, weaker states are states for which the state cannot function entirely independently or as independently from the generalized public, right? So a strong state can operate independently of the public, and a weaker state cannot. And so democratic states are deeply tied via a variety of institutional means that we'll cover later to the public. Authoritarian states, on the other side of this continuum, are stronger states, meaning that they are able to operate independently of the generalized public. There is little or no, in a perfect authoritarian state, individual freedom, and they combine closed societies with a lack of civil society, right? So that people are not able to just simply come together and talk and deal with things. Rather, things are subsumed inside the state. Now, there are a number of different kinds of authoritarian regimes. Generally, authoritarian regimes are going to be those where a small or a single individual exercises complete power over the state without having any without being constitutionally responsible to the public. And so we can say in an authoritarian regime, the public plays no significant role in selecting or removing leaders of office, and thus authoritarian leaders can dictate to the people, and this is actually where you get that term dictator, right? The one who can dictate to the people what's going to be happening. Authoritarian regimes can come in a variety of shapes and sizes. They could be fascist, communists, or they could simply be localized thugs who control what mechanisms of state power exists. Now, one subset of authoritarian regimes that we will be dealing with is something called totalitarianism. And Lenz, an author that we will talk about more, argues that totalitarian societies are those that have a highly centralized authoritarian regime that possesses some form of strong ideology, and on the basis of that ideology seeks to transform and absorb fundamental aspects of the state, society, and the economy. In other words, totalitarianism attempts to use power to transform all of the institutional fabric of a country according to some ideological goal. Now, there are a number of reasons why a country may be democratic or non-democratic, but we'll just take a look briefly here at three. One is that there are economic struggles. In other words, it might be the case that people who are better off economically will be more active in politics, and they will have a greater counterweight against individuals who would want to control. Specifically, there might be better education. And in essence, a society which has enough funds can gain awareness and assert individual rights. And there are some studies which seem to indicate that economies might be one of the sources of non-democratic rule, and on the flip side, of course, might be the cause of democratic rule. Only half of states with a GDP of $5,000 or less are democratic. Bump that up to a little over 8,000, and 90% are democratic. So the shift in this variable of GDP per person has a big impact, at least a big correlation, with the probability of a country being democratic or not. For instance, the rise of Nazi rule in Germany in the 1930s is preceded by devastating hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle-class Germans. And so when wealth was devastated, one potential hypothesis, one potential theory says, well, this is when totalitarianism's toehold is greater, and in this case, in Nazi Germany, it does indeed appear. The problem, of course, with this argument is difficult to say which way that it goes, right? Is it money that drives democracy, or is it democracy that drives money? So it could be, in fact, the reverse, rather than the GDP or economic issues causing authoritarianism. Perhaps authoritarianism causes poverty. So that's a difficult one to deal with. A second one is societal. The societal argues that there are certain people groups who may be predisposed because of the things that they regularly believe that would lead them to be more authoritarian, right? So for instance, if society is very negative on dissent, if society doesn't like conflict, if you value order more than you do dialogue, these kinds of things therefore could lead you to be more predisposed to be non-democratic or democratic. The problem is that both societal and next we'll talk about cultural are difficult to measure, and cultural will tell us about this. The cultural argument says that depending on whether existing cultural norms and values are consistent with the necessities of democratic practices. So for instance, some scholars will assert that Christianity, with its focus on the individual and individual personhood, is fertile ground for democratic development, while a religion such as Islam, which is not focused on the individual, could more easily lead to a culture of authoritarianism. As a matter of fact, this is the basic premise of some major political scientist writers such as Samuel Huntington in his book The Clash of Civilizations, where he argues that the primary determinant of a democratic development is culture, or as he expresses the concept, civilization. So now that we have the beginning, obviously we don't know in detail all the different kinds of democracies or non-democracies that could exist. We understand that there's this continuum along which there is democracies on the one hand and authoritarian regimes on the other hand. But these are not just perfect buckets, because what we're going to see is that you could have a mix of these. And this leads us to having to start thinking about what we want to call the space between. And what might we call the space between? The other possibility. So even once we understand the buckets of democracy and authoritarianism, democracy and authoritarianism is not an on-off switch. There is gradations of democracy and there are gradations of authoritarianism. You could be largely democratic but have some authoritarian institutions, or vice versa. You could be very authoritarian with a few democratic institutions, or you could be something dead in the center, dead in between. And what we call this conceptually in political science and comparative politics are democratic transitions. Countries in democratic transition are countries that fall somewhere between democracy and authoritarianism. They have a mix of both of these institutions inside of their state structures. And what's difficult about these is that it can be problematic as a researcher trying to understand if the country is moving towards or away from democracy, or if it's kind of stuck somewhere, right? In other words, maybe this is a more or less stable country that has a mix of democratic and non-democratic institutions. And so we begin to have to kind of wonder, what do you label the countries in this third space, and how do you scientifically assess its democratic direction? And this has been a huge amount of research gone into this for for comparativists. This has been a huge research question. And there has been a litany of names given to different kinds of forms that might fall in between for these democratic transitions. So we won't spend a lot of time trying to understand all of that in an introductory kind of way here, but rather let's take a look and bring back up another author, Samuel Huntington, because one long-standing popularized view that we're still going to see in the literature today is this idea that democracies actually come in waves, that you'll have countries move forward, and then after there's a forward, there will be a reverse. But not all of the countries will revert. In other words, so lots of countries begin to transition to democracy. Many will make it all the way to the democratic bucket or close to it, and then consolidate and remain stable. Others will end up not being stable and begin to fall back into less democratic forms, eventually becoming authoritarian. And that this process has occurred a number of times, but that generally speaking, more and more countries are becoming democratic. And this wave theorist is the same individual who I just mentioned writes Clash of Civilizations. It's Samuel Huntington. And Samuel Huntington writes a book called The Third Wave, where he argues that slowly over time there have been a building of democratic countries. And so for Huntington, he says the first wave is in the 1790s and is led by the United States and France, and that this sets off a lot of countries ending up becoming democratic, which doesn't get reversed until the 1920s with the widespread adoption of fascism. He then says that the second wave, and this is going to be really important for some of our purposes, begins in 1945 and moves into the 1960s with decolonization projects, where England and other European countries begin to move out of what had been colonized locations like India. And in this post-World War II world, lots of countries then start to become democratic. He then says in the 1960s and 1970s we have our second reverse, which is when you begin to have militarism in the underdeveloped world. And then finally, the third wave of democracy, which is noted for the democratization that happens in 1974 in Latin America. And theorists have moved from here. You can obviously, the third wave doesn't end off in contemporary times, but other theorists have moved from here to talk about it. Now, all of this begs one final and important question, and that is, okay, so if we see these waves, we can understand transition, the space between. Are countries moving in these waves because of the politics happening on the ground at the individual level? Or are there other structural, cultural, or other kinds of environments that can be manipulated? In other words, if democracy is a good thing, and people want democracy, and the wave theory kind of postulates that it is a good thing, the question becomes, can democracy be constructed? Or must democracy develop slowly from pre-existing ingrained trends? And this is the democracy as a lake or as an oil field question. Right? You can build a lake almost anywhere, right? So can democracy be created? Or do you have to find the certain correct conditions that exist? Like an oil field, right? You can't just tap oil anywhere. You have to explore and figure out where it is and where it's deposited. But I'm going to leave us on this question, and when we come back, what we're going to be talking about is in part this question and thinking more about specifically the different kinds of institutions that can make up a democracy. And so for now, we will pause and we'll bring that up next time.